The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the Copperhead mine like a funeral dirge, carrying with it the weight of 30 years' worth of unanswered questions. In the autumn of 2022, when investigative journalist Elena Voss first stepped onto the cracked asphalt of what had once been the mine's bustling entrance, she could never have imagined that she was about to uncover one of the most disturbing mysteries in American mining history. The Copperhead mine, nestled deep in the unforgiving mountains of eastern Kentucky, had been a lifeline for the town of Millfield for over half a century. Built in 1938, it had weathered the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic downturns. By 1992, however, the mine was living on borrowed time. Coal prices had plummeted, safety regulations had tightened, and corporate ownership had changed hands 3 times in 5 years. Most of the experienced miners had already moved on to more stable work, leaving behind a skeleton crew of desperate men willing to risk everything for one last paycheck. Among those men were Thomas Kellner, a 43-year-old father of 2 whose calloused hands had been pulling coal from the earth for 22 years. His weathered face told the story of a man who had seen too much darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Beside him worked Danny Reeves, barely 25, with bright eyes that still held hope for a future beyond the mine's suffocating tunnels. The third man, Miguel Santos, had immigrated from Mexico just 3 years prior, sending every spare dollar back to his family in Guadalajara while dreaming of bringing them to America. These 3 men shared more than just their final shift together. They shared a bond forged in the depths of the earth, where trust wasn't just important, it was survival. October 15th, 1992, dawned cold and grey, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like harbingers of doom. The morning shift began at 6 a.m. sharp, and by all accounts it started like any other. Kellner had kissed his wife goodbye, promising to pick up milk on the way home. Reeves had argued with his girlfriend about wedding plans, storming out with harsh words still hanging in the air. Santos had called his mother, as he did every Thursday morning, speaking rapid Spanish that his co-workers couldn't understand but recognized as the universal language of homesickness. The mine foreman that day was Curtis Wade, a man whose reputation for cutting corners was matched only by his ability to squeeze profit from seemingly barren rock. Wade had been pushing the crews harder than usual, extending shifts and ignoring maintenance schedules. The corporate executives, sitting comfortable in their air-conditioned offices hundreds of miles away, cared only about numbers on spreadsheets. They had no idea that their cost-cutting measures were creating a powder keg deep beneath the Kentucky mountains. At approximately 10:30 a.m., the 3 men descended into Tunnel 7, a section of the mine that had been flagged for structural concerns just 2 weeks earlier. The engineering report, buried in bureaucratic red tape, had recommended immediate reinforcement of the tunnel supports. That report was still sitting on Wade's desk, unopened, when Kellner, Reeves, and Santos rode the creaking elevator down into what would become their tomb. The last communication from the men came at 11:47 a.m., a routine radio check confirming their location and status. Kellner's voice crackled through the static, professional and calm Tunnel 7. All clear, moving to the north face. Those 7 words would be the last anyone would ever hear from the 3 miners. By 2 p.m., when the men failed to respond to their scheduled check-in, Wade began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Mining was dangerous work, and equipment failures were common, but complete radio silence was unusual. He dispatched another crew to investigate, led by veteran miner Jack Morrison, a man whose instincts had kept him alive through 3 decades of underground work. Morrison's team reached Tunnel 7 at 2:45 p.m. and immediately knew something was wrong. The air tasted different, thicker, with a metallic tang that experienced miners recognized as the signature of disturbed earth. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing fresh rockfall that blocked the passage where Kellner's team should have been working. But this wasn't just any cave-in. The pattern of debris, the way the rocks had fallen, seemed almost deliberate, as if the earth itself had reached up to swallow the 3 men whole. The rescue operation began immediately, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary accident. The amount of debris blocking the tunnel was staggering, tons of rock and earth that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. More disturbing was the complete absence of any trace of the missing miners. No tools, no equipment, no signs of struggle or attempts to dig themselves out. It was as if Kellner, Reeves, and Santos had simply vanished into thin air. For 6 grueling days, rescue teams worked around the clock, bringing in heavy machinery and expert cave-in specialists from across the region. The families of the missing men maintained a constant vigil outside the mine entrance, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and growing despair. Kellner's wife, Patricia, refused to leave even when the October nights grew bitter cold. She clutched her husband's coffee thermos like a talisman, whispering prayers into the wind that carried her words down into the depths where her husband might still be fighting for his life. Danny Reeves' girlfriend, Lisa Hammond, arrived at the mine site with a bag full of wedding magazines, as if planning their future could somehow will him back to the surface. She had been ready to apologize for their morning argument, to tell him that none of their petty disagreements mattered compared to spending their lives together. Now those words hung unspoken in the autumn air, growing colder with each passing hour. Miguel Santos' story was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. His family in Mexico, unable to afford the journey to Kentucky, could only wait by their phone for updates that never came. His mother, Carmen, had sensed something was wrong even before the official notification arrived. But she later told investigators that she had felt a sudden chill at the exact moment her son's radio went silent, as if the distance between them had suddenly become infinite. On the 7th day, the rescue operation was officially called off. The mine superintendent, a corporate yes-man named Richard Hoskins, who had flown in from the company's headquarters, he made the announcement with all the emotion of someone reading a grocery list. He cited safety concerns for the rescue crews, the instability of the surrounding tunnels, and the slim chance that anyone could have survived a week without food, water, or breathable air. But the families weren't ready to give up. They pooled their meager resources to hire an independent mining consultant named Dr. Rachel Stone, a geologist whose reputation for finding answers in impossible situations had made her a legend in mining circles. Stone arrived in Millfield 3 days after the official search was called off, carrying equipment that looked more suited to a space mission than a rescue operation. What Stone found in her preliminary surveys defied everything she thought she knew about mining accidents. The geological data made no sense. The tunnel collapse had occurred in an area where the bedrock was solid granite, formations that typically remain stable for centuries. More puzzling was the complete absence of the standard warning signs that preceded cave-ins: no minor rock falls, no structural groaning, no changes in air pressure or temperature. Stone's team used ground-penetrating radar to map the area where the 3 men had vanished, and what they discovered sent chills through even the most experienced investigators. The tunnel hadn't just collapsed, it had been sealed. The rock formation showed signs of having been compressed from both sides, as if massive forces had squeezed the earth together like a closing fist. The pattern was unlike anything in the geological literature, resembling more the work of some impossible machine than any natural phenomenon. Even more disturbing was what they found, or rather, what they didn't find. The radar detected no human remains, no equipment, no void spaces where the men might have taken shelter. The area where Kellner, Reeves, and Santos had last been seen was now solid rock, as if it had always been that way. It was as if the 3 men had been erased from existence itself. As winter approached, the investigation took on an increasingly desperate tone. The mining company, eager to avoid liability and negative publicity, began pressuring authorities to close the case. They offered modest settlements to the families, payments that came with strict non-disclosure agreements. Patricia Kellner was the first to refuse, her voice steady with a determination that surprised even herself. She had been a quiet woman, content to let others make the big decisions, but the loss of her husband had awakened something fierce inside her. "I don't want their money," she told the company's lawyers, her words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I want answers. I want to know what happened to my husband, and I want to make sure it never happens to anyone else's family." Lisa Hammond and Carmen Santos, despite the language barrier and the thousands of miles between them, formed an unlikely alliance united by grief and determination. They refused the settlements as well, choosing instead to fight for the truth. Their decision would prove to be more important than they could have imagined. The local police investigation, led by Detective Ray Maddox, was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Maddox was a good cop, honest and hardworking, but he was dealing with something far outside his experience. Missing persons cases usually involved human motivations, jealousy, greed, fear. This case had none of the usual elements. There were no enemies, no debts, no reasons for anyone to harm three hard-working miners. The evidence simply didn't add up to any scenario that made sense in the conventional world of criminal investigation. As 1992 drew to a close, the Copperhead mine case began to fade from public attention. The local newspaper ran fewer stories, the television crews packed up their equipment, and life in Millfield slowly returned to its normal rhythm. But for those closest to the mystery, the questions only grew more urgent with each passing day. Wade, the foreman, began drinking heavily and was fired in January 1993 after showing up to work intoxicated. He left town without telling anyone where he was going, leaving behind only whispered rumors about things he claimed to have seen in the mine's deeper tunnels. Morrison, the veteran miner who had led the initial search, requested a transfer to a surface job and refused to ever go underground again. When pressed for reasons, he would only say that some places were meant to stay buried. The mine itself was sealed permanently in March 1993, the entrance welded shut with heavy steel plates that bore official warnings about structural instability and toxic gases. The company's insurance settled the family's wrongful death claims for undisclosed amounts, and all records related to the incident were classified as proprietary information, as hidden behind layers of legal protection that would take decades to penetrate. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they are buried in places where the earth itself seems to reject them. The first hint that the Copperhead mine case was far from over came in the summer of 1995, when a group of teenage explorers managed to break through a section of the mine's sealed entrance. They were looking for adventure, maybe some old equipment they could sell for scrap metal. What they found instead was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The teenagers, led by a local troublemaker named Kevin Walsh, had brought flashlights and rope, planning to explore only the upper levels of the mine. They had heard stories about the missing miners, of course, but teenagers have a unique ability to convince themselves that they are immune to whatever dangers have claimed others. They made it approximately 200 feet into the main tunnel before they encountered something that sent them running back to the surface, screaming. Walsh, now a middle-aged man living in Ohio, still refuses to discuss the details of what he saw that night. In the only interview he ever gave, 10 years after the incident, he would only say that the mine wasn't empty like everyone thought. There was something down there, something that didn't belong in any world he understood. His three companions, traumatized by the experience, moved away from Millfield and have never spoken publicly about that night. The teenagers' break-in prompted authorities to reinforce the mine's ceiling, adding concrete barriers and round-the-clock security that seemed excessive for an abandoned mining operation. The official explanation cited liability concerns and environmental protection, but locals began to whisper that there were other reasons the mine needed to stay sealed. These whispers grew into legends, and the legends attracted attention from unexpected quarters. By the late 1990s, the Copperhead mine had become a magnet for paranormal investigators, conspiracy theorists, and amateur researchers convinced that the official story was hiding something much more sinister. Most of these investigators were dismissed as cranks and sensation seekers, but a few brought legitimate credentials and serious questions that demanded answers. One such investigator was Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a professor of geology at the University of Kentucky, who had spent her career studying unusual geological formations. Crawford had read Dr. Stone's original report and found herself intrigued by the anomalous data surrounding the tunnel collapse. In 1998, she petitioned for permission to conduct her own survey of the sealed mine, citing academic research purposes. The mining company's response was swift and absolute: access denied, no exceptions, no appeals. The vehemence of their refusal only strengthened Crawford's conviction that something important was being hidden. She began her own investigation using publicly available records, satellite imagery, and interviews with former mine employees who were willing to talk off the record. What Crawford uncovered formed the foundation of a theory so disturbing that she initially hesitated to publish it. The Copperhead mine, she discovered, had a history of unusual incidents dating back decades before the 1992 disappearances. Workers had reported strange sounds echoing from the deeper tunnels, equipment that moved by itself, and areas where compasses spun wildly without explanation. Several miners had requested transfers after claiming to see things in the darkness that couldn't be explained by shadows and imagination. More significantly, Crawford found evidence of previous disappearances that had been covered up or explained away. In 1967, 2 miners had vanished during a night shift, their absence not discovered until the next morning. The official report blamed a methane gas pocket that had supposedly overcome the men before they could escape, but no bodies were ever found. In 1974, an entire work crew of 5 men had reported seeing lights moving in a section of the mine that had no electrical connections. When a supervisor went to investigate, he found the area completely empty, with no sign that anyone had been there. The pattern suggested that whatever had happened to Kellner, Reeves, and Santos in 1992 was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of something that had been building for years. The mine seemed to be hiding a secret that went far beyond corporate negligence or regulatory failures. Crawford's research caught the attention of Elena Voss, the investigative journalist who would eventually bring the Copperhead mine story back into the public eye. Voss had built her career on exposing corporate cover-ups and government corruption, but the mine case offered something different, a mystery that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries of investigative journalism. In 2001, Voss published her first article about the Copperhead mine disappearances, a carefully researched piece that raised serious questions about the official investigation and the mining company's role in suppressing information. The article generated significant interest but little concrete action. The families of the missing miners, still fighting their legal battles after nearly a decade, welcomed the renewed attention but warned Voss that she was entering dangerous territory. "They don't want this story told," Patricia Kellner had said during their first meeting, her voice carrying the weight of years spent fighting a system designed to silence her. "And they have ways of making sure it stays buried." Voss would soon learn just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The investigation that would ultimately crack open the Copperhead mine case began not with human effort, but with an act of nature that no amount of corporate power could suppress or control. In the spring of 2012, 20 years after the original disappearances, the most severe flooding in Kentucky's recorded history swept through the mountains, tearing away decades of careful concealment and exposing secrets that were never meant to see daylight. The floodwaters that raged through Millfield reached levels that local residents said defied belief. The creek that ran past the sealed mine entrance became a torrential river, powerful enough to move boulders and tear apart the concrete barriers that had protected the mine's secrets for 2 decades. When the waters finally receded, they left behind devastation that would take years to repair and revelations that would change everything about the Copperhead mine case. Among the debris scattered by the flood was an object that would reignite the investigation with an urgency that couldn't be ignored, a bright yellow hard hat, and still sealed in its original plastic packaging, bearing the name Thomas Kellner in faded black marker. The discovery of Kellner's hard hat raised questions that demanded answers, but those answers would prove to be more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The sealed package suggested that Kellner had never actually worn the hat on his final shift, but witness testimony and employment records clearly showed that he had been properly equipped when he entered the mine. The implications were staggering. If Kellner hadn't been wearing his assigned safety gear, what had happened to the equipment he was actually using? And more disturbing still, how had his unused hard hat ended up sealed inside a mine that had been closed for 20 years? The flood had done more than just reveal Kellner's hard hat. It had also exposed sections of the mine's upper tunnels that had been thought permanently sealed, creating new access points that would allow investigators to finally penetrate the mine's secrets. But as Elena Voss stood at the edge of those newly opened passages, staring down into darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight's beam, she couldn't shake the feeling that some doors were meant to stay closed. The answers she sought were waiting in the depths of the Copperhead mine, but they would come with a price that no one was prepared to pay. The three miners who had vanished in 1992 were about to reveal their final secret, and it would shatter everything the world thought it knew about what lurked beneath the surface of reality itself. The summer of 2012 would forever be remembered in Millfield as the season when the Earth itself decided to confess its sins. Elena Voss stood at the mouth of the newly exposed tunnel, her breath forming clouds in the unexpectedly cold air that seemed to seep from the mine's depths. The sealed hard hat bearing Thomas Kellner's name lay in an evidence bag at her feet, but it was the whispers coming from the darkness ahead that truly captured her attention. At first she dismissed the sounds as wind moving through the tunnels, a natural phenomenon in any cave system. But as she listened more carefully, the whispers seemed to form patterns, almost like conversations held in a language she couldn't quite understand. The local authorities, overwhelmed by flood damage throughout the county, had given Voss unprecedented access to the mine site, perhaps hoping that her investigation would finally put the decades-old mystery to rest. They had no idea what they were about to unleash. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford arrived in Millfield 3 days after the flood, her geological equipment loaded into a modified van that looked more like a mobile laboratory than a research vehicle. At 62, Crawford had spent her entire career studying the impossible, but nothing in her extensive experience had prepared her for what awaited in the Copperhead mine. The readings from her instruments defied every law of physics she thought she understood. The temperature inside the exposed tunnels registered a consistent 42 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the sweltering August heat outside. More puzzling was the electromagnetic activity. Her sensors detected patterns of energy that resembled nothing in the geological literature. The readings suggested that something deep within the mine was generating its own magnetic field, powerful enough to interfere with electronic equipment and compass readings within a half-mile radius. At Crawford's first descent into the mine, accompanied by Voss and a local spelunking expert named Marcus Webb, revealed a landscape that seemed frozen in time. The tunnels showed no signs of the structural damage that should have resulted from 20 years of abandonment. The support beams stood straight and solid, the tracks for the mining cart system remained perfectly aligned, and the air tasted surprisingly fresh, as if some unseen ventilation system was still operating. But it was what they found in the main corridor that truly unsettled the investigation team. Scattered throughout the tunnel were personal items that shouldn't have existed, modern cell phones that wouldn't be invented for years after the mine's closure, work tools bearing manufacturer dates from the future, and most disturbing of all, photographs of people the investigators didn't recognize, images that appeared to have been taken inside the mine itself but showed sections that didn't match any of the existing tunnel maps. Webb, who had explored abandoned mines throughout Kentucky for over 30 years, announced after their first expedition that he would not be returning. "I have been in a lot of dark places," he told Voss as he packed his equipment with shaking hands, "but I have never been anywhere that felt like it was watching me back." Despite Webb's withdrawal, Voss and Crawford pressed forward with their investigation, driven by a compulsion that seemed to grow stronger with each descent into the mine. They established a base camp at the tunnel entrance, bringing in generators, communication equipment, and enough supplies to support extended underground exploration. Neither woman acknowledged the growing sense that they were being drawn deeper into something that was orchestrating their every move. On their third day underground, they made the discovery that would change everything. A section of Tunnel 7 that hadn't appeared on any of the mine's original blueprints. The passage stretched deeper into the mountain than should have been possible, disappearing into darkness that their most powerful lights couldn't penetrate. The walls showed tool marks that were impossibly precise, as if carved by machinery that operated with surgical precision. More disturbing were the sounds that echoed from the depths of the unknown tunnel. Not the whispers they had heard near the entrance, but something else entirely, a rhythmic tapping that followed no pattern Crawford could identify. The sound came in bursts of 3, followed by longer pauses, then resumed with slight variations that suggested intelligence behind the rhythm. As they ventured deeper into the mystery tunnel, their equipment began registering readings that made no scientific sense. Crawford's electromagnetic sensors detected signatures that resembled metallic structures, but ground-penetrating radar showed nothing but solid rock. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes showing variations of 30 degrees within a single step. Most unsettling of all, their GPS units began displaying coordinates that placed them hundreds of feet below their actual position, as if the very fabric of space was twisted within the mine's depths. It was Crawford who first noticed that they weren't alone in the tunnel. As they paused to examine a particularly unusual rock formation, her peripheral vision caught movement in the shadows behind them. When she turned to look directly, nothing was there, but the impression of presence remained strong enough to make her skin crawl with primitive fear. "Something's following us," she whispered to Voss, her voice barely audible over the constant tapping that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Voss had sensed it too, a presence that felt both ancient and utterly alien, something that existed in the spaces between perception and reality. Their light seemed dimmer in this section of the mine, as if the darkness itself was actively absorbing the illumination. More than once, both women caught glimpses of movement at the edge of their vision, shadows that moved independently of their light sources. The breakthrough came when they discovered a side chamber approximately 800 feet from the tunnel entrance, a circular room that hadn't existed on any mining survey. The chamber's walls were covered with symbols that resembled no human writing system, carved deep into the rock with the same impossible precision they had observed throughout the mystery tunnel. At the center of the room stood a metallic structure that defied easy description, part machine, part organic growth, humming with an energy that made their teeth ache. Crawford's instruments went haywire in the chamber, registering energy signatures that exceeded the equipment's measuring capacity. The electromagnetic readings suggested that the metallic structure was some kind of generator, producing power levels that should have been impossible to contain within such a confined space. More disturbing was the realization that the structure appeared to be actively growing, its metallic surfaces expanding in real time as they watched. It was Voss who made the connection that would unlock the mystery's most terrifying secret. The symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't random decorations, they were a form of record-keeping, documenting something that had been happening in the mine for decades. Using photographs and rubbings of the symbols, she began to identify patterns that corresponded to dates, always in groups of 3, always preceded by the same recurring symbol that resembled a downward-pointing spiral. The dates told a story that chilled both investigators to their core. The earliest symbols corresponded to 1967, the year of the first documented disappearances. Subsequent dates matched every unexplained incident Crawford had uncovered in her research, creating a timeline of vanishings that stretched back over 25 years. The final entry, carved with the same impossible precision as all the others, bore the date October 15, 1992, the day Kellner, Reeves and Santos had vanished. But the symbol record didn't end in 1992. New dates had been added since then, carved into previously blank sections of the wall. The most recent entry was dated just 3 days earlier, the exact day Crawford and Voss had first entered the mine. The implication was inescapable. Something in the mine was documenting their investigation, recording their presence with the same methodical precision it had used to catalogue decades of disappearances. They weren't just investigating a mystery, they had become part of it. As this realization settled over them, the rhythmic tapping that had followed them through the tunnels suddenly stopped. The silence that replaced it felt heavy with malevolent attention, as if something vast and hungry had finally decided to acknowledge their presence. The metallic structure at the chamber's center began to pulse with a brighter light, and new symbols started appearing on the walls, and carving themselves into the rock without any visible tool or hand to guide them. Crawford grabbed Voss by the arm, her voice urgent with barely controlled panic. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned toward the chamber's exit, they discovered that the passage they had used to enter was no longer there. The tunnel mouth had been sealed with the same seamless rock that had mystified investigators for 20 years. They were trapped in the chamber with whatever force had been claiming victims for decades, and their lights were beginning to dim. The metallic structure pulsed faster, and the newly carved symbols began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. The chamber filled with a sound that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite machinery, a harmony that seemed to resonate in their bones and make their thoughts feel thick and sluggish. Voss found herself taking an involuntary step toward the structure, drawn by a compulsion that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. It was Crawford who broke the spell, shouting Voss's name and grabbing her colleague before she could reach the metallic growth. The physical contact seemed to disrupt whatever force was influencing them, and for a moment, the chamber returned to normal illumination. In that brief respite, they saw something that would haunt them forever: 3 human figures standing behind the structure, their faces bearing the features of Kellner, Reeves, and Santos. But these weren't the men who had vanished in 1992. These figures possessed an otherworldly quality that suggested they existed somewhere between life and death, their eyes reflecting the same inner light that pulsed through the metallic structure. They didn't speak, but their presence communicated a message that chilled both women to their souls. The mind didn't just claim its victims, it transformed them into something else, something that served purposes beyond human understanding. Santos, or the thing that had once been Santos, stepped forward and gestured toward a section of the chamber wall that had been hidden in shadow. As he moved, the rock face became transparent, revealing another tunnel that stretched deeper into the mountain than should have been physically possible. And through the transparent wall, Crawford and Voss could see other chambers, other structures, and other figures that had once been human beings. The mine wasn't just a place where people disappeared, it was a collection point, a processing center for something that had been operating for far longer than the relatively short history of coal mining in Kentucky. The symbols on the walls weren't just records of disappearances, they were coordinates, marking the locations where the mine's influence extended through underground networks that connected to similar operations across the continent. Kellner stepped forward next, his transformed features somehow managing to convey both recognition and terrible sadness. He pointed to a fresh symbol that was carving itself into the wall, today's date, followed by 2 spiral marks. The message was clear: Crawford and Voss were being added to the mine's collection, but their transformation wouldn't be immediate. They were being offered a choice that the others hadn't received. The choice became apparent as a new passage opened in the chamber wall, this one leading back toward the mine's entrance. But the price of escape was written in symbols that appeared as fast as they could read them: silence, compliance, and recruitment. They could leave, but they would become agents of whatever force controlled the mine, helping to identify and lure future victims into the depths. Crawford looked at Voss, both women understanding that they had stumbled into something far larger than a local mining mystery. The Copperhead mine was just one node in a network that spanned continents, possibly centuries. The disappearances weren't random accidents or isolated incidents, they were part of a systematic harvesting operation that had been hidden beneath the surface of human civilization for generations. The transformed figure of Reeves gestured toward the symbols on the wall, and new information began to appear, dates and coordinates that revealed similar operations in mines, caves, and underground facilities across North America. Each location showed the same pattern: initial disappearances, followed by official cover-ups, then decades of carefully managed accidents that fed the network's insatiable appetite. But the symbols also revealed something else: the network was preparing for something larger. The scattered harvesting operations were just the preparation phase for an event that would dwarf all previous activities. The coordinates pointed to major population centers, underground systems in cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The implications were staggering. Whatever controlled the Copperhead mine was planning something that would affect millions of people. As this information burned itself into their consciousness, Crawford and Voss faced an impossible decision. They could accept the escape route being offered, saving their own lives at the cost of becoming complicit in future disappearances. Or they could refuse, joining the ranks of the transformed and losing their humanity forever. But there was a third option, one that neither the mine's controlling intelligence nor its human servants had anticipated. Voss had documented everything during their investigation, uploading files and photographs to secure servers that would automatically publish if she failed to check in within 48 hours. The mine's influence was vast, but it wasn't omnipotent. It relied on secrecy and official complicity to maintain its operations. Crawford realized what Voss was planning and made her own choice. Instead of moving toward either offered passage, she began destroying her equipment, and overloading the electromagnetic sensors and creating feedback loops that disrupted the chamber's energy systems. The metallic structure began to pulse erratically, and the transformed figures of the missing miners flickered like images on a damaged television screen. The chamber filled with a sound like screaming metal, and cracks began to appear in the walls. Whatever force had maintained the mine's impossible architecture for decades was being disrupted by the electromagnetic interference. The network's carefully maintained systems were collapsing, and the entity controlling them was being forced to choose between maintaining its local operations or preserving its larger plans. In the chaos of the collapse, Crawford and Voss found themselves thrown toward the original tunnel entrance as the chamber's reality warped around them. The last thing they saw before losing consciousness was the transformed figures of Kellner, Reeves, and Santos reaching toward them with expressions that might have been gratitude or warning or both. They awakened at the mine entrance 12 hours later, their equipment destroyed and their memories fragmentary. Local emergency responders found them suffering from exposure and disorientation, but physically unharmed. The tunnel they had entered was gone, sealed once again by rock that showed no evidence of recent disturbance. But Voss's dead man switch had worked exactly as planned. While she and Crawford recovered in the hospital, news outlets across the country were receiving unprecedented documentation of the Copperhead mine mystery. Photographs, electromagnetic readings, audio recordings, and detailed analysis painted a picture of something operating beneath the surface of official reality. The response was swift and predictably bureaucratic. Government agencies seized the evidence, citing national security concerns. The mine site was declared a restricted area under federal jurisdiction. Voss and Crawford found themselves subject to non-disclosure agreements backed by criminal penalties that would ensure their silence for the rest of their lives. But the truth had already begun to spread through channels that official suppression couldn't completely control. Other investigators picked up the threads of the story, connecting it to similar mysteries at underground sites across the continent. Families of missing persons began to recognize patterns that suggested their losses weren't isolated tragedies but part of something much larger. The Copperhead mine itself was sealed permanently in late 2012, entombed in concrete and steel that went deeper than any mining operation had ever reached. The official explanation cited environmental contamination and structural instability, but local residents noticed that the sealing operation included equipment more suited to military containment than civilian construction. Elena Voss never published another investigation. She moved to a small town in Oregon, taking a job teaching journalism at a community college and refusing all interview requests about her mining research. Elizabeth Crawford returned to the University of Kentucky but shifted her focus to surface geology, never again venturing underground for any reason. But late at night, when the wind blows through the mountains of eastern Kentucky, residents of Millfield still report hearing sounds that seem to come from beneath the earth. Not the whispers that had once echoed from the mine entrance, but something else, a tapping rhythm that follows a pattern of 3, then pauses, then resumes with variations that suggest intelligence behind the sound. The families of Thomas Kellner, Danny Reeves, and Miguel Santos never received the closure they had sought for so many years. The official investigation was concluded without explanation, the evidence classified beyond their reach, and the truth buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence. But in quiet moments when they gather to remember their lost loved ones, they sometimes catch glimpses of familiar faces in photographs taken near other underground sites, faces that look exactly as they did on October 15, 1992. The network that claimed the Copperhead mine's victims continues to operate, its influence spreading through underground systems that connect facilities across continents. The disappearances continue, carefully spaced and officially explained as accidents, natural disasters, or simple cases of people who chose to vanish from their old lives. But something has changed since Crawford's electromagnetic disruption damaged the network's local operations. The pattern of disappearances has become more erratic, less predictable. Whatever intelligence controls the underground harvest seems to be adapting, evolving, preparing for a final phase that will make its previous activities seem like preliminary testing. The symbols that once appeared only in the depths of the Copperhead mine have been reported at sites across North America, carved into cave walls, subway tunnel foundations, and basement excavations. Each appearance marks another node in the expanding network, another harvest point feeding something that grows stronger with each acquisition. In 2019, a construction crew breaking ground for a new shopping center in suburban Denver uncovered a chamber identical to the one Crawford and Voss had discovered. The crew vanished overnight, leaving behind only their equipment and a series of symbols carved into the chamber walls. The construction site was quickly purchased by a federal agency and converted into a restricted research facility that officially doesn't exist. Similar discoveries have been reported in cities across the continent, each one followed by the same pattern of disappearances, official silence, and federal acquisition. The network is preparing for something, building toward a culmination that will dwarf all previous activities. The truth about the Copperhead mine disappeared into classified files and buried reports. But the consequences of that truth continue to spread through underground channels that no amount of official suppression can completely seal. Somewhere beneath the surface of everyday reality, like something ancient and patient is preparing to harvest on a scale that will make the loss of 3 miners seem like a footnote in a much larger story. Thomas Kellner, Danny Reeves, and Miguel Santos were just the beginning. Their transformation from missing persons into something else entirely was merely a test run for operations that will soon encompass entire populations. The mind that claimed them continues to pulse with alien purpose, connected to a network of similar facilities that spans continents and serves purposes that human understanding cannot fully grasp. The sealed hard hat that started Elena Voss's investigation remains in an evidence locker somewhere, bearing witness to a truth that official reality refuses to acknowledge. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's connected to something that exists in the spaces between what humanity knows and what humanity fears to discover. The whispers that once echoed from the Copperhead mine have spread to other locations, other underground systems, other places where the boundary between the known world and something else grows thin. Those who hear them report the same message, repeated in dozens of languages but always carrying the same essential meaning. The preparation phase is nearly complete, and the harvest is about to begin. In Millfield, Kentucky, the wind still carries sounds from beneath the earth, tapping out a rhythm that grows more complex with each passing year. The pattern suggests intelligence, purpose, and an patience that spans generations. Whatever claimed Thomas Kellner, Danny Reeves, and Miguel Santos in 1992 is still down there, still growing. They're still preparing for something that will make their disappearance seem like the opening movement of a symphony that most of humanity will never live to hear in its entirety. The Copperhead mine mystery officially ended with bureaucratic silence and classified documents, but the truth it revealed continues to spread through channels that official suppression cannot reach. The 3 miners who vanished on October 15, 1992, became unwilling witnesses to something that threatens to reshape human civilization itself. Their story isn't over. It's just waiting for the right moment to resume. And when the network beneath our feet finally completes its preparations and it begins the final harvest that will make every previous disappearance seem like practice for the main event. The mine is sealed, but what it contained was never contained at all. It was simply waiting for the right time to reveal itself to a world that isn't prepared for what lies beneath the surface of everything we think we understand about reality itself.